Zoomed out. Okay. There you go, good luck.
Good morning, my name is Chris Esnault, and today I'll be presenting my AP research project on analyzing the perceived LGBTQ+ inclusivity of Connecticut high school health education programs. But first, the context. Adequate sexual health education is a fundamental part of an adolescent's development, according to the CDC. According to a Connecticut 2015 Youth Risk Behavioral Survey, though, many students in the sexual minority do not seem to be receiving this level of health education, as nearly 20% of high schools in Connecticut were inadequate in teaching about sexual orientation, and only 77.5% of high schools in Connecticut taught about sexual orientation, gender roles, identity, and expression. Because inadequate sexual health education has been associated with an increased prevalence of bullying and victimization among LGBTQ youth, it therefore becomes crucially important to understand the state of health education in Connecticut. Through conducting my lit review, I realized that there existed significant gaps in research pertaining to LGBTQ inclusive health practices. Firstly, and most importantly, no study that I read sought to understand LGBTQ inclusivity in the health classroom and was conducted in Connecticut. Additionally, no studies implemented a holistic approaches to data collection that measured perceived inclusivity. Most were just either student focus groups or teacher focus groups. Lastly, no study I reviewed paired state standard evaluation with teacher and student desired LGBTQ education, which is ultimately what differentiates my methods from the other methods that I reviewed. Which leads to my question, how can high school sexual health education be evaluated for perceived LGBTQ inclusivity in the state of Connecticut? Before conducting my study, my initial hypothesis was that I will be able to create a survey that will show students perceive Connecticut sexual health curricula as relatively more exclusive, while teachers perceive this same curricula as relatively more inclusive. And after settling on this hypothesis, I began to draft my methods. After careful consideration, I decided to settle on a dual survey approach. To do this, I am surveying both teachers and students about their experiences teaching or being taught 10 pre-selected health standards in an LGBTQ light. I used the study, How Can We Make LGBTQ Inclusive Sex Education Programs Truly Inclusive, a case study of Chicago Public School policy and curriculum published by Dr. Elizabeth Jarp Ratner in 2020 as inspiration for my methods. Ratner used both teacher interviews and student focus groups to find the need for more explicit affirmations of LGBTQ identities in the health classroom. And it is this teacher and student approach that inspired my holistic data collection that relies on both a teacher and a student survey. 8 of the standards I surveyed students and teachers about were pulled from Connecticut's Healthy Balanced Living Curriculum Framework for health teachers, and 2 of the standards were pulled from the Centers for Disease Control's Health Education Curriculum Analysis tool. I used the study LGBT, Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, Transgender, Queer, and Questioning Youth's Perspectives of Inclusive School-Based Sexuality Education, published by Dr. Chris Goen in 2014, to understand from an LGBTQ point of view, what students felt were missing, what topics and standards students felt were missing from their health education. And then that guided me in my selection of standards from the Healthy Balanced Living Curriculum Framework and the HECAT. The survey consisted of 4 components: a demographics component, a standards component, a desired education component, and an additional comments component. As shown here, the most important component, or the standards evaluation component, asks students and teachers their level of exposure to or teaching of 10 standards from the HBLCF and HECAT in an LGBTQ light. To do this, I took a standard from the HBLCF like define and describe healthy sexuality and sexual expression, and turned it into, for students, were you taught how to define and describe healthy sexuality and sexual expression? And for teachers, do you teach students how to define and describe healthy sexuality and sexual expression? Students and teachers then have to rate their level of exposure to or teaching of this standard from a 0 to 3 Likert scale, with 0 being not taught and 3 being taught extensively. And this is how I ultimately seek to indirectly measure, or how I ultimately sought to measure LGBTQ inclusivity in the health classroom. These questions were then followed up by a question that asked students and teachers to select 3 additional standard families, which encompass many other additional standards from Connecticut's Healthy Balanced Living Curriculum Framework that they would have liked to learn more about in terms of LGBTQ related information, as well as an area for any additional comments about experiences pertaining to LGBTQ education in the health classroom. Now my results. In the end, my eligible sample consisted of 151 students from 3 high schools in Fairfield and New Haven counties. 15.1% were members of the LGBTQ community, 51.7% were female, 46.4% were male, and 1.9% were another gender. Additionally, my survey collected responses from 6 teachers in 4 high schools across Fairfield and New Haven counties. All three of the teacher response, or of the 6 responses, overlapped with the 3 high schools that I collected student responses from. This figure depicts the results of the standard section of the student survey. A 0 was chosen 12.4% of the time, which can be seen in the red. A 1 was chosen 22.9% of the time, which can be seen in the orange. A 2 was chosen 26.5% of the time, which can be seen in the yellow. And a 3 was chosen 32.9% of the time, which can be seen in the green. The 3 standards perceived by students as least inclusive, which was found by summing up the percentage of students who chose either a 0 or a 1 for the 10 standards, were Standard 7, plan to advocate against bias and discrimination, Standard 2, differentiate between orientation, behavior, and identity, and Standard 10, how to effectively support peers of all sexualities. The 3 standards perceived by students as most inclusive, which was found by summing up the percentage of students that chose either a 2 or a 3 for each standard, were Standards 3, the impact of HIV and AIDS, Standard 6, ways a person can respond to harassment, and Standard 9, the benefits of respecting individual differences. It's important to note that both teachers and students overlapped, with perceiving Standards 2 and Standard 7 as least inclusive, and Standard 9 as most inclusive. Interestingly, it was found that the average standard score for members of the LGBTQ community was 1.448, and that of their straight counterparts was 1.884, a difference that was found to be statistically significant using a t-test. This figure depicts the results of the student section of the desired education component of the survey. The top 3 standard families that students wanted to learn more about in terms of LGBTQ information included the family physical, mental, emotional, social growth, and advocacy over on the left, self-management of healthy behaviors, and communication skills. And after comparing student and teacher results, it was found that both of these groups overlapped in their desire to learn more about physical, mental, emotional, social growth, and advocacy, and self-management of healthy behaviors, most in terms of LGBTQ information. After analyzing the student and teacher data sets separately, both were then compared to see discrepancies in perceptions of teaching and learning of the 10 standards. This figure depicts the differences in average student and teacher perceptions of LGBTQ inclusivity of the 10 standards. Generally, teacher perceptions of LGBTQ inclusivity were greater than student perceptions of that same curricula. Additionally, the magnitude of difference of perceived LGBTQ inclusivity between teachers and students was greatest in Standard 5, Laws and Policies that Protect People from Harassment, Abuse, and Exploitation, Standard 7, Plan to Advocate Against Bias and Discrimination, and Standard 10, How to Effectively Support Peers of All Sexualities. Now, the discussion. After seeing that both teachers and students perceived, it was the, It was seen that average teacher perceptions of LGBTQ inclusivity were greater than average student perceptions of that same curricula. This information is important because it implies that there is a disconnect between student and teachers in how LGBTQ inclusive each group sees their curricula. A disconnect I suspected in my a priori hypothesis. Teachers perceiving their curricula as slightly more inclusive than students may be due to teacher bias towards self-created curricula. After seeing that both teachers and students perceive Standard 2 and Standard 7 as least inclusive, it was conducted that students and teachers want to and need to learn more about basic lessons in differentiation of LGBTQ terms, as well as ways to advocate against bias and discrimination inside and outside of the health classroom. This is a finding that surprised me, as I had not even considered possible overlap between students and teachers and educational desires during my hypothesis formation. Additionally, after seeing the standard families, self-management of healthy behaviors, and physical, mental, emotional, social growth and advocacy were ranked highest among students and teachers in their desire to learn more LGBTQ-related information, it can be concluded that teachers and students have at least some overlapping desires in what they'd like to learn about. This agreement is important because it provides teachers with the information necessary to strengthen teaching and learning of LGBTQ information pertaining to these standard families. Another interesting finding was that there exists a statistically significant relationship between sexuality and perception of LGBTQ inclusivity in health standards, with LGBTQ students perceiving their health experiences as less inclusive than their straight counterparts. A phenomenon that may be due to LGBTQ students being more consciously aware than their straight peers of exclusive or inadequate teaching practices, thus causing them to be more critical of their health experiences. This finding is important because it points to the idea that LGBTQ students are likely rich and critical resources of information for ways to strengthen health curricula, and that straight students may be less aware, consciously or not, of the lack of LGBTQ information presented in the health classroom. Implications, limitations, and future research. These discrepancies in student and teacher perceptions show that more must be done to address the needs of LGBTQ and heterosexual students in the health classroom in terms of learning LGBTQ-related information. Specifically, teachers must begin incorporating LGBTQ-related lessons into their curricula, focusing on differentiating between sexual orientation, behavior, gender and identity, recognition of bias and discrimination, as well as ways to act against that bias and discrimination, because these were the standards seen by both students and teachers as least LGBTQ inclusive. Furthermore, teachers and students must begin having open and honest conversation to bridge gaps in potential misunderstanding of content. And teachers may even want to begin distributing course evaluations to see specific areas of improvement. Lastly, teachers must have greater access to professional development opportunities for acquisition of LGBTQ knowledge. For as one teacher surveyed put it, there's not a bunch of professional development related to LGBTQ inclusivity outside of definition of terms associated with sexual identity. My study did come with its limitations though. First, a survey sample of 151 students and 6 teachers did not make the results generalizable to the state of Connecticut or even Fairfield County. Next, both teachers and student surveys relied on perceptions, and perceptions are by nature incredibly subjective and hard to measure and compare against one another. Lastly, because the surveys, particularly the student survey, relied on memory recall of standards learned in a student's 2 to 4 years of health education in high school, many students may have just simply forgotten being taught some of the standards. With my results collected, there is much potential for future research. For example, a cohort study could be conducted over 4 years that surveys a group of students immediately after completion of each year's health class to determine health class to eliminate the memory recall bias that could have likely played a part in my study. Additionally, a study similar to mine could be conducted with increased participation of Connecticut high schools, teachers, and students that make the results more generalizable to either the state of Connecticut or a county within Connecticut. And lastly, a study could be conducted that looks at the effects of professional development on class lessons and student experiences inside and outside of the health classroom, as multiple teachers indicated their desire for increased access to LGBTQ-related professional development. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris.
All right, row 5. How did the choices you made when designing or implementing your research method impact your research process?
I think the choices that I made when designing and implementing my research methods impacted my findings most significantly because I had originally chosen to pair a student survey with a self-created rubric, and that was going to be how I wanted to do it. I wanted a very quantitative analysis tool like a rubric paired with like a more qualitative but subjective student survey. And that's how I was going to do it. And then as Ms. Rocca knows, when I had gone through the evaluation aspect with the rubric, it just wasn't working out because it was really hard to analyze health teachers' curricula. So I chose to scrap the rubric in place of a teacher survey, which still provided my eventual findings with a holistic idea of inclusivity, but it was not as like standards and curricular based as I would have liked.
Thank you.
How do your findings provide directions for future research in the field?
I think my findings provide directions for future research in the field, most significantly probably because I was able to see that there existed a statistically significant difference between sexuality and perceptions of LGBTQ inclusivity, with the average LGBTQ student score being 1.448 and that of straight peers being 1.884. But I don't necessarily know why that is. So I think it would be great for researchers to maybe see the effects of sexuality on LGBTQ perceptions, or even to isolate just LGBTQ students in research similar to this.
If you could revisit your research process, what would you do differently and why?
If I could revisit my research process, I probably would I would have liked to pair my surveys with qualitative interviews of students and teachers. I think the additional comments component of my surveys, it did give me comments that I ended up using in my paper, which I didn't really present in this presentation, but it didn't give me like a full picture of what I would have liked to see from students and teachers to like ask them questions that I really wanted to know, because like standards evaluation isn't everything to health. It's more the experiences you get in the health classroom, so I would have liked that.
Oh, look at that smile.
I'm done.
I'm done.